Imagine stepping into the kind of night where the air hangs heavy and unmoving, a night that feels stitched together from the stale scent of forgotten pharmacies and the quiet desperation of neighbourhoods, where hope is something people stopped expecting years ago. And before we dive any deeper, take a moment to tap that like button, subscribe if you enjoy wandering through stories like this one, and drop a comment telling us the city you're watching from and what the clock says on your side of the world, because what follows is a descent into the strange, murky life of a pill that started its journey pretending to be harmless relief, yet ended up becoming the cheapest monster modern misery has ever raised. A tablet so ordinary that no one thought twice before swallowing it. A soft painkiller designed by meticulous German chemists who, still reeling from a medical scandal that shook their industry, accidentally set loose a substance that would drift through deserts, ports, shanty towns, and contraband routes like a counterfeit promise passed from one exhausted hand to another, and somewhere along the way armed groups discovered it was steadier than bravery. Teenagers found in it a shortcut out of their own restless minds, and entire governments, drowning in corruption or simply too overwhelmed to care, responded with laws that looked good on paper but melted instantly in the heat of reality. Imagine a marketplace held together by dust and metal roofs, where counterfeit mixtures glow faintly beneath plastic tarps. A place where the pill we're talking about becomes a bargain bin replacement for heroin, codeine, or the cheapest liquor, offering a crooked lifeline to people who cannot afford anything else except the hope that maybe, just maybe, their thoughts will quiet down for a few hours, and this is how Tramadol stopped being medicine and turned into a social signal. A chemical whisper shared by entire regions that have grown used to living halfway numb because feeling everything would be unbearable. But to understand how this unassuming tablet managed to implant itself in hospitals, with cracked windows, in street markets that open before dawn, in pharmacies that barely pretend to follow regulations, we have to return to the lie that gave birth to its empire, manufacturers assuring politicians and doctors that this molecule did not seduce the brain, did not create cravings, did not mimic opioids except in the most superficial ways, and countries battered by corruption, poverty, war, or the absence of functional healthcare clung to those claims like a universal skeleton key that could unlock relief from every kind of pain, physical or emotional. Yet beneath that clean marketing shine, something darker was taking shape, because Tramadol began behaving exactly like everything it was promised not to resemble, binding itself to those who used it, demanding higher doses, stirring the mind with a strange cocktail of lethargy, soft euphoria, blurred thoughts, and the illusion of stability, turning desperate teenagers into daily users and worn-out labourers into moving silhouettes that kept working even as their inner world collapsed grain by grain. And as this cheap monster spread, authorities averted their eyes, grateful to have a sedative that didn't require controlled prescriptions, grateful, or perhaps relieved, that large swathes of their population could be kept quiet, slowed, pacified without the cost or bureaucracy of stronger opioids, and soon the pill seeped into ports, border crossings, deserts crossed by trucks under starlight, sprawling cities where resignation mixes with poverty, until both feel like the same ingredients simmering in a single pot, and from that mixture rose a parallel economy built on tiny white tablets sold for almost nothing, replacing what once required heroin, codeine, or moonshine, turning addiction from a dangerous luxury into a low-budget routine, a small ritual for millions who had no other exit from their own bodies, their endless jobs, or the violence coiled around their daily lives. And by the time anyone realized what had happened, Tramadol had already slipped out of the category of medication and into something far more symbolic, a muted cry from continents that would rather exist half sedated than wrestle with the sharp edges of pain. And all this because a pill designed to cure ended up feeding a creature that grows wherever misery is plentiful, a creature that doesn't need hidden labs or elaborate chemistry, only a population worn thin enough to reach for a tablet that costs less than a meal and numbs more than a wound, becoming the modern bargain-priced descendant of classic opium, the quiet chemical blanket pulled over societies where suffering is abundant and real solutions, as usual, remain out of reach. A story like this can only begin in a place stained by ghosts, a building of polished corridors and locked laboratories in Germany, where the lights never truly went off. The same compound that decades earlier had sent a wave of suffering across continents with a drug that turned newborn innocence into lifelong tragedy. And as the world continued to glare at the company responsible for that catastrophe, Grunenthal, its researchers kept working behind doors thick enough to muffle both the shame and the hum of the machines. There, in rooms that still carried the metallic scent of sterilized glassware and burnt coffee, scientists struggled to rebuild a reputation shattered by the memory of thalidomide, a disaster studied today as a lesson in what happens when ambition races ahead of ethics, and in the middle of this atmosphere, a cocktail of corporate guilt, scientific pressure, and a yearning for redemption. One German chemist, brilliant, relentless, perhaps too enamored with his own hypotheses, began tinkering with synthetic structures, trying to craft a painkiller that did not rely on the poppy's ancient curse, a compound that could quiet human suffering without awakening the familiar demon of addiction. And from those long nights of trial and error emerged a molecule with no drama in its colour or form, a grey, unremarkable creation that behaved like a hesitant hybrid, part opioid in its shadow, part antidepressant in its glow, odd enough to intrigue the researchers, and mild enough for them to believe they had stumbled onto something uniquely gentle. And Grunenthal, starving for a scientific victory pure enough to soften the stain of their past, clung to that discovery like a final lifeboat, advertising this discrete chemical as their proof that they could give the world a medicine that healed rather than harmed, not realizing they were nurturing a compound whose personality split like a blade hidden inside a velvet sleeve. Early tests designed to reassure overlooked the subtle trap built into the molecule's design, the ability to lift spirits just enough to entice, to trigger dependency, just enough to bind, and to be sold cheaply enough to seep into every corner of the globe unnoticed. So while researchers toasted the arrival of a seemingly safe analgesic, what they had really done was open a door that no one would ever manage to close again, especially after governments, pharmaceutical companies, and doctors, eager for a miracle, began repeating the marketing slogan that would define an era: low addictive potential, a phrase so comforting and careless that it travelled from sterile laboratories to hospital corridors, from hospital corridors to crowded pharmacies, from pharmacies to the desperate streets of entire nations, until reality itself rose up to prove the lie. Somewhere between that chemist's quiet pride and the world's uncritical embrace, a new irony took shape, because the scientist who had hoped to create a clean, redeeming medicine ended up gifting humanity another discreet monster, a creature disguised as a soothing tablet, patiently waiting for the right amount of misery to multiply, and when Tramadol finally hit the market, it did so with the grace of a street vendor selling hope for less than the cost of bread, wrapped in language so seductive that even the most cautious doctors swallowed its promise without asking where that miraculous safety came from. After all, the company had mastered a simple but lethal strategy. Dress the molecule in a term that sounds harmless but means nothing in pharmacology: mild painkiller, a category vague enough to anesthetize suspicion, yet comforting enough to sell an opioid packed with hidden mechanisms like a pirate chest filled with traps. And because their pitch came supported by carefully curated data, immaculate graphs, and conclusions written with the poetic optimism of a marketing department drunk on absolution, minimal addiction risk, minimal abuse potential, safe even in long-term therapy, governments relaxed, physicians prescribed with ease, and pharmacies distributed with open-palmed enthusiasm. But beneath that polished surface lay an illusion built from sleight of hand, because the clinical trials were short, the volunteers hand-picked, the doses controlled so tightly that anything alarming dissolved into statistical dust, and while the laboratories celebrated their sanitized findings, the real world unfolded far away from their controlled rooms, populated not by ideal patients, but by those who woke up every morning in bodies full of pain, workers grinding through endless shifts, young people begging for an exit, and entire communities where doctors were scarce, pharmacies abundant, and explanations rare. And as the company kept insisting with a smile that Tramadol was different, because it wasn't purely opioid, because it also touched serotonin, because it didn't lift the mind the same way morphine did, what they were truly offering was a chemical Trojan horse, a medicine that looked benign on the outside but carried inside enough mechanisms to hook, distort mood, fuel dependence, and lure thousands into daily rituals they could no longer abandon. And the industry understood the perverse advantage embedded in this ambiguity. Tramadol was weak enough to escape the strict control reserved for classic opioids, yet strong enough to keep entire populations functioning, beneath a numbing fog, which made it the ideal business model, because a drug not dangerous enough to be banned but addictive enough to guarantee steady customers is every company's dream. An empire built not on healing, but on selling bottled relief to a world too tired to ask what it costs. They presented it to the world as the perfect pill for overwhelmed nations, the kind that fit neatly into the pockets of underfunded clinics, exhausted doctors, and health systems patched together with tape and hope. And soon every problem, back pain, anxiety, exhaustion, the weight of a life lived too close to the edge, seemed to come with the same prescription. Tramadol on Monday, Tramadol on Friday, Tramadol whenever survival felt too heavy. And this routine slid so naturally into the global bloodstream that no conspiracy was needed. The manufacturers accomplished their goal simply by letting the drug drift across borders, wearing the mask of modern, safe, affordable science. A chemical whip disguised as kindness that crept into communities without raising so much as an eyebrow, until years later, when the consequences rose like a tide, no one had bothered to predict, flooding entire regions with a second-tier opiate that companies insisted with rehearsed warmth was under perfect control. And because that story was so soothing, so irresponsibly convenient, Tramadol shed its modest reputation and transformed into a pharmaceutical Trojan horse that conquered nations without a single act of force, slipping quietly past defences because it had been dressed as an economic saviour. And the real genius, if one could call it that, was not in the formula or the price tag, but in the narrative crafted around it, a narrative repeated through glossy brochures, polished conference slides, sales reps whispering confidence into the ears of exhausted physicians, and journal articles that were advertisements wearing lab coats, all chanting with ceremonial certainty that this analgesic carried a low risk of addiction, a phrase so comforting that millions of doctors adopted it as unquestionable truth, and millions of patients heard it as a kind of secular blessing. In a world where pain is a daily currency, the promise of a strong pill that doesn't enslave you feels like a magic key offered without warning that it opens a trapdoor, and the deception worked because the data backing it had been expertly trimmed. Studies too short, samples too small, conclusions glowing with optimism that any clinician with experience should have found suspicious, but no one raised their voice because the marketing was designed to sound like natural law, and in countries drowning in overburdened hospitals, endemic corruption, and doctors forced to choose between speed and collapse, no one had the time or energy to question anything. Meanwhile, the manufacturers chanted their slogan with messianic confidence: "You will never become dependent," even as the molecule did exactly what they swore it would not, slipping into the bloodstream, activating opioid receptors, adjusting neurotransmitters, and, with repeated use, carving a chemical path that demanded higher doses, more pills, more days in a row, until what began as treatment for a sore back hardened into a toxic partnership, from which escaping meant enduring tremors, savage anxiety, sleepless nights that stretched into hallucinations, vomiting, muscle agony, panic storms, depressive collapses, and in severe cases seizures that exposed the claws hidden in this supposedly gentle compound. The illusion of safety was so perfectly constructed that governments eased regulations, pharmacies sold freely, doctors prescribed without fearing audits, and pharmaceutical companies filled their pockets while the world believed this tablet was only slightly more dangerous than an over-the-counter pain reliever with a dramatic personality, and the outcome, predictable yet ignored, spread across impoverished neighbourhoods, African cities, Middle Eastern towns, and European working-class communities, where people swallowed Tramadol with the casual calm of someone convinced nothing bad could happen if the label said it didn't hook you, until one day they realised months or years had passed, and their bodies now reacted to the absence of the pill, as if something vital had been torn away. And while all of this unfolded, manufacturers clung to the illusion they had created, insisting the problem lay with patients who used it wrong, or doctors who didn't follow instructions, as though the fault belonged to those who trusted the promise instead of those who engineered it with surgical precision. Because the myth of low risk had not simply opened the door to widespread abuse, it kicked the hinges off and invited in a crisis that still drifts through ports, deserts, cities, and neighbourhoods like a silent shadow, proving that the most effective lie in modern pharmacology is never the one that frightens, but the one that comforts. And if anyone wants to understand how Tramadol became a quiet global disaster, they need only open the official leaflets tucked inside its boxes. Those white sheets filled with reassuring language that for years acted as a legal sedative for medical conscience, because buried between sterile tables and neatly phrased warnings lay the oldest trick in the industry. Tell the truth, but only the portion that will not cause trouble. In the safety section of the official leaflets, the reader would encounter a kind of language so polished, so diplomatically engineered, that it felt crafted to avoid offending either the patient or the Ministry of Health. Phrases folded with surgical politeness, rare adverse responses, clinically insignificant risks, long-term use generally well tolerated, wording tailored to coax tired medical professionals into turning the page without noticing that behind this pharmaceutical courtesy lurked a mechanism of dependence already unravelling the stability of entire nations. The brilliance of the deception was never in denying addiction outright, an error too clumsy to survive scrutiny, but in dissolving it beneath layers of jargon, softening it with adverbs, burying it inside comparisons that made Tramadol appear like a timid, distant cousin of true opioids, a chemical relative so far removed that no one should worry, and clinical guidelines replicated those same paragraphs with the blind reverence of someone copying sacred doctrine, offering a few half-hearted lines about possible discomfort when discontinuing it, an occasional nod to sensitivity in a minority of users, and then pages of tidy recommendations about dosage and titration, as if dependence were nothing more than a hypothetical inconvenience almost no one would encounter. And the trick lay entirely in tone. Nothing in the text sounded alarming, nothing conveyed urgency, every sentence draped in a neutral calm that suggested the worst outcome might be a passing headache, while reality simmered far from that sanitized prose, revealing itself in rural clinics, provincial hospitals, and modest consulting rooms where the wallpaper peeled from humidity and routine, and where doctors began noticing something unsettling. Their patients returned sooner than expected, not because pain persisted, but because their bodies felt wrong in the absence of the pill. Tremors appeared without cause, nights turned suffocating, tears surfaced too easily, sleep fractured into shards, symptoms that didn't align with the soft language of the manual, and as medical records filled with cases that contradicted the official narrative, the printed guidelines continued to speak from a parallel universe in which Tramadol behaved like a gentle, obedient sedative. This dissonance between paper and lived experience produced a dangerous effect. Physicians doubted their own observations because the documents they trusted, those modern oracles of clinical truth, listed nothing severe, and if the manual didn't mention it, then perhaps the patient was overreacting. Perhaps they were anxious, perhaps they needed counselling rather than pharmacological scrutiny, and in this way the industry achieved its most insidious victory, converting dependence into an administrative ghost, a concept diluted across enough technical phrasing to seem non-existent. For years that strategy flourished as official documents circulated through ministries, universities, and medical congresses like untouchable scripture, until the day the numbers of abuse became too massive to hide and the contradiction detonated. How could a drug labelled as safe produce withdrawal storms resembling those of far stronger opioids? How could those delicate pamphlets minimise something that, in reality, left people shaking, sleepless, panicked, vomiting, aching, collapsing under the weight of a chemical absence they never expected to face? The answer was simple, cynical, and absolute. The full truth had never been printed, only the portion convenient for sales, convenient for governments desperate for cheap analgesics, convenient for a system that preferred tablets over investment in healthcare, and thus the medical literature of Tramadol functioned as an elegant curtain that let everyone glance away while dependence rooted itself slowly, protected by the prestige of technical vocabulary and validated by years of unintentional complicity. A perfect lie precisely because it carried the authority of official paper. And to understand why Africa became the planet's vast human reservoir of Tramadol, one must stop gazing at maps as though they were orderly drawings and begin seeing them as they truly are. Territories where physical suffering merges with political instability, where hospitals resemble silhouettes rather than functioning institutions, and where any cheap substance capable of pushing someone through the day evolves instantly into a survival tool because the continent did not seek Tramadol. It arrived like an opportunistic guest discovering the ideal soil in which to settle, expand, and multiply to levels no laboratory had predicted or dared to acknowledge. The first reason was brutally straightforward: cost. The tablet was so inexpensive that in countless regions it was priced lower than a slice of bread, and in countries where half the population carries bodies worn down by endless labour, repeated conflict, forced displacement, and untreated chronic illness, the equation was undeniable. If something eases the burden even slightly, it becomes indispensable. The second force was administrative chaos. In nations where ministries of health change hands like fading game pieces, Tramadol flowed through ports, deserts, and informal borders into cities where pharmacies operate like market stalls. No oversight, no audits, no questions asked. Mountains of boxes arriving from India and China stacking beside shipments of rice, second-hand clothing, and reconditioned batteries, and no one saw a reason to halt them because, by law, they weren't dangerous opioids to officials, they were just more medicine. To merchants, they were profitable stock, and to users, they were the only thing making existence tolerable. The third factor was the weight that never appears in statistics, the psychosocial pressure crushing daily life in places like Lagos, Bamako, Niamey, or Dakar, where traffic suffocates, wages barely hold people above water, heat presses like a physical burden, insecurity hums in the background, and mental exhaustion devours more strength than any tropical disease. And in that environment, Tramadol offered something no government program could promise. Artificial energy, extended endurance, a counterfeit clarity, the illusion of being stronger than one's own circumstances, the fragile possibility of pushing through another day without collapsing. That is why the drug was embraced not just by city dwellers, but by those whose days are carved from physical strain. Fishermen who spend entire nights balancing on wooden boats beneath moonless skies, farmers whose backs fold after sunrise and straighten again out of obligation not choice, street vendors who walk 20 endless kilometres through dust and heat to sell enough to survive, motorbike couriers weaving through colossal metropolises like human sparks between metal, and miners who descend into tunnels where breathing becomes a gamble, each of them discovering in Tramadol a kind of chemical fuel, an artificial combustion that let their bodies keep moving long after logic begged for rest. And then came war, the fourth force in this chain, reshaping the drug's destiny in ways no chemist had imagined, because in conflict zones stretching from Libya to Nigeria to the entire Sahel, Tramadol flowed like ammunition, keeping fighters awake, dulling the sting of minor wounds, muting fear, and converting exhaustion from a human limit into a background detail barely worth noticing. And armed groups, improvised militias, and underfunded armies adopted the pill as though it were standard equipment, triggering a clandestine trade so vast it defied geography. Trucks rumbling across the Sahara carrying crates stacked to their roofs, ships sinking under the weight of pharmaceutical cargo, smuggling routes where a single tablet held more value than any political speech. And then there was the fifth factor, cruel in its simplicity, the absence of alternatives, because in much of the continent obtaining morphine or other potent analgesics borders on impossible thanks to international regulations shaped more by fear of misuse than by the basic right not to suffer. So while wealthier nations debate protocols, vast regions of Africa have almost nothing. No reliable anesthesia, no strong pain medication, no dedicated pain programs, and into that vacuum Tramadol slipped, not because it was superior, but because it was the only substance available without bureaucratic hurdles, without scrutiny, without explanation, and in territories marked by structural poverty, porous borders, and bodies pushed to the edge, the continent became the unintentional laboratory for Tramadol, a giant experiment in which millions swallow a pill never meant to function as the energetic backbone of a population, where dependency disguises itself as routine, and where authorities overwhelmed or indifferent choose to look away as the tablets circulate until they blend into the landscape, like a white shadow passed quietly from hand to hand, holding up entire communities while draining their future. And if one wishes to grasp why Tramadol slipped into the war kits of half a continent, imagine a combatant paid almost nothing, fed even less, armed with equipment that should have been retired decades ago, and living with a life expectancy sometimes measured in days. Under those conditions, any chemical that keeps a soldier awake, walking, numb to pain, and temporarily deaf to fear becomes a weapon in its own right. And Tramadol, with its strange duality, part gentle opioid echo, part crude stimulant, fit that need with uncanny precision, not through military planning or scientific discovery, but through experimentation by the fighters themselves, who, scavenging whatever the local market offered, found that these cheap tablets transformed them into versions of themselves that were harder, colder, more durable, able to endure marches that should have broken them, patrols that stretched into dawn, and chaotic engagements where adrenaline alone could not sustain them. In the conflicts tearing through Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Nigeria, Tramadol spread like a campfire rumour turned battlefield gospel, first used by the youngest recruits to stay alert through their shift, then adopted by mid-ranking officers desperate to stave off fatigue, and eventually consumed even by veterans hardened by years of violence, because all of them quickly understood that Tramadol blunted not only the physical agony, omnipresent in combat, but also that instinctive emotional spike that flares just before engagement, the inner scream urging the body to flee, and under its effects the mind dimmed, just enough that hesitation evaporated while the body responded with unnatural resilience. The pill also provided something no commander could offer: cheap synthetic courage, and fighters who once trembled at the prospect of a night assault hurled themselves into operations with borrowed confidence, convinced they were faster, stronger, more resistant to bullets and shrapnel, and the tragic irony is that many genuinely felt less pain after being wounded, which meant they kept fighting with injuries that would normally force a soldier to collapse, not turning them into heroes but into broken human machines, unable to assess danger, and often dying because the drug urged them forward when their bodies had nothing left to give. Within insurgent groups and militias, Tramadol acquired a disciplinary function, distributed before suicide missions, before ambushes, before forced marches, treated almost like a sacrament in groups such as Boko Haram, whose leaders discovered that a medicated fighter is more compliant, less rebellious, and above all less likely to desert when fear claws at him. And for guerrilla commanders, Tramadol was never a medication, but a psychological lever costing mere cents while multiplying the brutality inflicted on the ground. Even Nigerian army soldiers recounted encounters with opponents who did not seem to feel the impact of small-caliber bullets, who advanced with a possessed determination, unreactive to injury or to the sight of their own fallen comrades. And behind these terrifying scenes were often massive doses of Tramadol mixed with alcohol, local herbs, or improvised stimulants, yet dependence also took hold inside official armies, swelling quietly beneath uniforms, another hidden consequence of a pill that was never meant to shape the destiny of wars yet somehow became woven into their fabric. Many soldiers began with half a tablet, just enough to stay sharp during a night shift, then graduated to a full one to endure the desert sun, then moved on to 2 to quiet the panic that built up after watching their villages burn, until one day they realized that without Tramadol they couldn't sleep, couldn't think, couldn't carry out the rituals of military life without feeling as though the ground was splitting beneath them. And worse still, side effects like agitation, irritability, impulsive behavior, and altered vision fed a cycle of violence where poor judgment, accidental shootings, and reckless decisions multiplied like sparks in dry wind, turning the drug into an invisible combatant from Mali to Nigeria, from the cracked plains of the Sahel to the crowded labyrinth of Maiduguri. A substance cheap enough to be everywhere, potent enough to swallow fear and pain, and dangerous enough to create fighters who no longer recognize the border between bravery and self-destruction. Modern war in these regions isn't powered solely by bullets and resentment, but also by tablets promising to make combat more bearable, while in truth extending chaos, ruining bodies, and trapping thousands of young men in a conflict where even the fear meant to protect them is erased by a white pill that should never have left the hospital. And to understand how Tramadol became an essential component of contemporary terrorism, one must peer beyond the trenches and into the inner logic of groups that survive by manufacturing dread. Organizations like Boko Haram, ISIS in Libya, and dispersed militias across the Sahel, which do not only require weapons, recruits, and money, but malleable bodies, young men who won't question orders, fighters capable of enduring inhuman days, and warriors able to treat their own pain, and the pain they inflict, as irrelevant clutter. Into that dark niche where psychology intersects with brutality, Tramadol slid with unnatural precision, not glamorous like cocaine nor expensive like heroin, but something far more useful. A cheap, stable pill easy to move, easy to hide, and alarmingly effective at reshaping the mind of a combatant until he becomes merely another instrument of the group. In territories under Boko Haram's control, former fighters describe its distribution as routine as receiving boots or ammunition, handed out before nighttime raids, before ambushes, before suicide missions, not for strength as the myths claim, but because it reduced fear to suicidal lows, smothered self-preservation, distorted risk, and dulled the emotional shock of watching others die, producing a blend of false calm, irrational daring, and synthetic resilience that turned abducted teenagers into warriors, directed not by instinct or conscience, but by chemistry imposed on them. Leaders understood the power instantly. He who controls relief controls the soldier, and ISIS factions in Libya followed the same pattern, treating Tramadol shipments crossing the Mediterranean not merely as contraband, but as strategic supplies stored like ammunition, distributed as reward, withheld as punishment, and often forced upon recruits, especially adolescents dragged from their villages until their ability to resist orders eroded completely. The result was a fighter who could walk for miles under brutal sun without collapsing, participate in suicide operations without trembling, and carry out atrocities without the natural break of human instinct. Because for commanders, Tramadol outperformed ideology. It stripped away empathy, drowned fear, and transformed violence into a mechanical task. And control was not only psychological but economic, because armed groups realized Tramadol offered a double profit. They fed it to their troops and sold it to civilians who needed energy to work, numbness to survive hunger, or temporary relief from chronic pain, using the revenue to buy weapons, pay bribes, lure new recruits, and fund operations, creating a perfect cycle where the drug sustained fighters, enslaved communities, and empowered leaders all at once. Deserter testimonies repeat the same chilling pattern. Combatants unable to sleep without Tramadol, racked by violent crises when deprived of it, agreeing to suicidal missions in exchange for another handful of tablets, and commanders exploiting this dependency with ruthless clarity. If you want your dose, you obey, and obedience often meant pure cruelty. Village massacres, mass kidnappings, attacks on humanitarian convoys, improvised explosions in crowded markets, with the pill functioning as a chemical mute button that silenced pain, silenced conscience, silenced any fragment of inner resistance. And to grasp why Tramadol eventually became the narcotic that bound desperate groups together, one must look at the daily lives of millions of young men who grew up without promises, without opportunities, and without a single reason to believe tomorrow could be anything other than a repetition of the same unforgiving day. In the outer neighbourhoods of Lagos, Bamako, Freetown, Dakar, Cairo and Tripoli, daily life bears no resemblance to the numbers printed in official reports. These are dusty streets where informal jobs pay in coins and exhaustion, where violence blends into the scenery like another shade of weather, where police often act as predators rather than protectors, and where adolescence ends abruptly, replaced by responsibilities that, in other countries, are carried by people twice their age, and in that emotional and economic void any substance offering even the faintest reprieve. A moment without fear, a breath unburdened by the crushing weight of poverty, becomes magnetic. Tramadol arrived perfectly positioned to fill that role, potent enough to alter the mood, cheap enough for anyone to afford, and wrapped in enough legal ambiguity that swallowing one felt less like breaking the law and more like treating an invisible wound. But its price alone wasn't what crowned it the drug of desperation. It was the function it assumed within an exhausted generation. Because for thousands of young people with no access to education, with no formal employment, no social safety net, and no realistic path to upward mobility, Tramadol became an emotional flotation device, while officials dismissed the crisis as recreational consumption, though on the ground the truth looked nothing like recreation. The pill wasn't taken to celebrate, it was taken to forget. Forget the pressure from home, the absence of work, the social humiliation, the daily violence, the total silence of the state. Tramadol didn't manufacture joy, it provided suspension, a chemically induced pause in lives where real pauses didn't exist. And unlike drugs requiring complicated criminal networks, Tramadol was everywhere. Homemade pharmacies, street vendors, open-air markets, roadside stalls, even grocery shops selling tablets as if they were energy candies. So no one needed a dealer. Any boy could buy it without a single question, and that accessibility turned it into another piece of the environment. So normalized that for many teenagers taking Tramadol felt like drinking a soda that woke something inside, and danger remained invisible because health authorities themselves treated the pill as a benign medicine. and in places starved of medical information, a legal stamp carries more weight than any whispered warning. The psychological effect of tramadol also aligned disturbingly well with the emotional needs of these young people. Unlike alcohol, which crushes, unlike marijuana, which slows, unlike expensive stimulants that remained out of reach, tramadol produced an uncanny blend of numbness, soft euphoria, and counterfeit energy that allowed them to face brutal days with slightly less weight on their shoulders, resolving nothing, of course, but offering a seductive illusion. The world hurt a little less, and when life hurts every day, that tiny reduction becomes addictive. Soon the drug embedded itself into youth rituals. It was swallowed before a block party, before working 12 hours under a merciless sun, before a football match, before sex, before studying, becoming in poor neighbourhoods a universal tool used to wake up, to calm down, to feel brave, or simply to endure another day. And that versatility, that chemical lie of becoming whatever the moment required, cemented its role among young people living at the edge of despair. But what truly transformed tramadol into a trap with no exit was its ability to ensnare, because what first appeared as an ally became within weeks a daily necessity. Withdrawal, striking brutally and without warning, incomprehensible for those who never imagined the pill could be addictive, acute anxiety, muscle pain, fractured sleep, volcanic irritability, shortness of breath, a hollow ache in the chest, all of it culminating in the inevitability of returning to the dose. And because no one had been warned, because medical guidelines had glossed over the risk, young people misread the symptoms as stress, a bad night, simple fatigue, never realizing they had already stepped into a chemical loop that offered no escape, and assistance in their neighborhoods simply did not exist. Thus, in a continent where hope is often a luxury, tramadol became the drug of resignation. Not because it offered pleasure or trended socially, but because it aligned perfectly with the despair of a generation, becoming a daily companion, a white tablet promising temporary relief yet delivering only an invisible chain, binding young people to a substance that spread not because its effects were extraordinary, but because life without it had become too harsh to face unmedicated. And to understand what happened in Egypt, one must imagine a country already balancing at the edge of collapse, long before the first tablet crossed its borders, a vast nation heaving with people, its healthcare system gasping for breath, its economy grinding under strain, and its everyday reality shaped by constant stress, insufficient wages, and a social climate as heavy as desert heat. A landscape so dry that a single spark could ignite an entire firestorm. Tramadol wasn't the spark in Egypt. It was the gasoline poured over a landscape already brittle from years of strain. The country didn't merely adopt the pill, it unknowingly elevated it into a national phenomenon that swiftly eclipsed even the notorious heroin crisis that ravaged entire generations in the 90s. And what unfolded next wasn't an epidemic but a chemical invasion, fueled by a lethal blend of easy access and overwhelming need. Because unlike heroin, which demands criminal networks and money most Egyptians do not have, tramadol slipped into the country on boats, through tunnels, via ports and warehouses as casually as shipments of tea, arriving mostly from India and China, where it was manufactured on an industrial scale and sold for laughable prices. And once in Egypt, it spread through pharmacies, informal shops, street vendors, and even unlicensed kiosks that offered the tablets as if they were imported chewing gum. And because the government delayed for years before labelling it a controlled substance, a perfect storm emerged. Millions of potential consumers, zero regulation, mountains of supply, and a price anyone could manage. And then came the cultural shift. Egypt is a country built on brutal physical labour, where 12-hour shifts are standard, where millions toil in informal jobs that wear the body down like sandpaper, and where emotional fatigue clings like dust, from truck drivers to construction workers, underpaid police officers, fishermen in the Delta, farmers in Upper Egypt, and delivery riders weaving through Cairo's infernal traffic. Everyone needed something to keep them upright, and tramadol became exactly that. Artificial energy, an anesthetic for exhausted muscles, a chemical patch for minds worn thin, and when an entire nation begins consuming a drug out of necessity rather than pleasure, consumption doesn't rise, it detonates. But the truly terrifying twist came when tramadol collided with another deeply Egyptian force, social pressure, because many men took it to perform better, to endure endless shifts, to silence anxiety tied to financial strain. while others swallowed it in secret to avoid feeling defeated by daily life, and soon the country's consumption had nothing to do with nightlife or recreation. It became a tool for survival, a pill taken not to flee reality, but to withstand it, and in a place where reality is already unforgiving, that meant millions of tablets swallowed every day. The situation spiraled so violently that by the time the government finally classified Tramadol as a dangerous drug, the damage had carved itself into the national fabric. Seizures began appearing on the news, tons of tablets, containers packed with hidden cargo, shipments disguised inside furniture, carpets, vehicles, fishing boats, and Tramadol became so profitable that criminal networks realized they could earn more from pills than heroin, and with far fewer risks, transforming Egypt into the great market of North Africa, a hub where Tramadol was not only consumed locally but redistributed outward. And while authorities boasted of record-breaking confiscations, addiction continued to rise, with public hospitals encountering withdrawal symptoms severe enough to belong in manuals for much stronger opioids, convulsions, paranoia, tremors, psychotic episodes, crushing depression, panic attacks. Many patients unaware they were addicted at all because they believed the old myth that Tramadol did not belong to the same family as narcotics, and that collective misunderstanding turned Egypt's crisis into something even harder to treat than heroin addiction, because the heroin user recognizes his dependence, while the Tramadol consumer sees himself as responsible, hard-working, resilient, until the body reveals otherwise. Within just a few years, the country went from a serious heroin problem to a monumental Tramadol crisis. And unlike heroin, where the enemy is clearly marked, Tramadol came disguised as medicine, cloaked in legitimacy, and even as the government continues seizing literal tons of it, demand remains too enormous for supply to falter, and the darkest truth is that this crisis didn't grow because people chased pleasure, but because they chased endurance, functionality, the ability not to collapse, making Egypt's situation far more complex than any hedonistic epidemic, because when dependence grows from daily necessity, solutions slip far out of reach. And if Egypt was the battlefield shaped by consumption, India became the factory feeding the world's illicit demand, not by social misfortune or geographical coincidence, but by something simpler and far harsher. Its pharmaceutical industry is so massive, so fragmented, and so saturated with small manufacturers that distinguishing legitimate production from clandestine work is nearly impossible, even for its own regulators, for no other country houses an ecosystem where thousands of laboratories operate simultaneously, each under different licenses, using refurbished machinery, purchasing active ingredients from opaque intermediaries, producing generic medicines in volumes so high that not even the accountants can track them. In this industrial chaos, making Tramadol, legally or illegally, became as routine as bottling drinking water, and what truly transformed India into a magnet for the clandestine trade was the architecture of the sector. Small factories pressed against larger ones, warehouses connected by improvised corridors, supply chains overlapping like spider webs, intermediaries selling chemicals without receipts, and a bureaucracy so slow that a trafficker could forge in 20 minutes the documents an inspector takes months to process. Wherever there should have been audits, there were dusty piles of paperwork. Wherever inspectors should have stood, there were empty chairs, and wherever chemical control should have existed, there were offices running on rules written for another decade. Inside that unguarded industrial space, Tramadol was produced without pause, tablets stamped on machinery originally meant for vitamins, capsules sealed inside boxes whose production dates were little more than fiction, entire batches created during night shifts that no supervisor ever recorded, and the engine driving this parallel universe wasn't poverty but pure profit, because India's clandestine Tramadol economy operated not like a cartel but like a shadow industry. Shell companies renting pill-pressing machines by the hour, cooperatives manufacturing only the excipient powders before selling them to hidden workshops, printing houses turning out packaging indistinguishable from legitimate brands, and freelance chemists advising microfactories on how to tweak formulas for stronger effect without attracting attention. There were no gunmen in these operations, only accountants, exporters, customs officers, and mid-tier businessmen hiding illegality beneath perfectly typed invoices, an industrial ecosystem rather than a criminal jungle, and the machinery's defining trait was speed. Because whenever one country tightened its laws, a new clandestine lab sprang up in another Indian state, and when a factory was shut down, 2 more appeared in rural zones where regulatory offices didn't even exist, while the country's physical structure, thousands of medium-sized towns and a web of highways connecting entire provinces, like a single logistical membrane, allowed shipments to move without relying on major ports or airports, meaning tramadol could be produced in an obscure village, mixed with agricultural cargo on a truck, stored in an intermediate warehouse, repackaged alongside legitimate pharmaceuticals, and be ready for export the next day without undergoing a single meaningful inspection. Another crucial piece was the chemical ecosystem itself, because India's vast market of legal precursors, used to manufacture hundreds of legitimate medications, made acquiring the ingredients for tramadol as easy as buying sugar, with companies ordering tons of chemical compounds monthly, and any extra batch purchased in cash disappearing without trace, and in a sea of authorized substances, clandestine tramadol dissolved seamlessly into the industrial tide. But when the first massive shipments surfaced in Africa and the Middle East, India's government was forced to investigate and found chaos they had never imagined. Licensed laboratories running double shifts, printing houses producing packaging for 20 brands of the same drug, warehouses filled with unlabeled boxes, logistics firms transporting goods they didn't even know they carried, and microfactories small enough to fit in an apartment, yet producing thousands of tablets daily. India wasn't a clandestine producer. It was the perfect ecosystem where illegality blended with legitimacy so thoroughly that no clear boundary survived. And in the end, India became the world's unofficial tramadol factory, not out of ideology, but because its pharmaceutical sector was so enormous, flexible and porous that producing tons of off-the-books medication was as simple as setting up an extra production line behind a metal curtain. What was illegal didn't hide, it merely dissolved into the legal environment, feeding the most profitable clandestine market on earth. Tramadol didn't spread like traditional drugs. It required no cartel kings or violent empires. Its global journey resembled the path of a hyper-cheap commercial product, slipping effortlessly through every gap in international trade. And while nations debated whether to classify it as a controlled substance, entire tons of it were already travelling along maritime routes, crossing endless deserts, and slipping across borders with the natural ease of any commodity moving from factory to buyer. The oceans functioned as silent highways, beginning in the ports of India and later China, where among containers packed with legitimate medicines, boxes of tramadol travelled disguised as nutritional supplements, wellness products, or medical supplies, and the secret wasn't deception but overwhelming volume. When thousands of containers depart daily, detecting one suspicious shipment is like trying to hear a whisper in a storm, and inspectors simply don't have time to open each box. A fact traffickers exploit fully. Cargo ships carrying these loads crossed the Indian Ocean, past Oman and Yemen, diverted toward Dubai or Jebel Ali, made brief stops in secondary ports where documents were stamped without anyone opening a single package, then continued toward the Red Sea or the Gulf of Guinea. For the ships, tramadol was an insignificant fraction of cargo, but for the people waiting on shore, every box represented thousands of dollars. And then came the desert, the oldest highway in human history, because if the ocean is the artery, the Sahara is the nervous system of smuggling. When shipments reached ports like Cotonou in Benin, Lomé in Togo, or other discrete points along the Gulf of Guinea, the journey didn't end, it simply vanished from visibility, as traffickers divided the loads into manageable parcels, loaded them onto pickup trucks, and drove them across ancient routes that have existed since the salt caravans. These paths cut through Nigeria, Niger, Chad, Mali and Libya. Not formal roads, but tracks carved by tyres and by generations of smugglers who know every dune, every hollow, every checkpoint where the police pretend to enforce the law. The desert acts as border and highway at once, vast, empty and impossible to police, allowing tramadol to flow across a continent as effortlessly as wind skimming over sand. By the time night swallows the horizon, the convoys are already moving, long chains of dusty trucks crawling across unmarked terrain, headlights dimmed, engines low, weaving through the dark like animals trained to avoid predators, changing direction whenever a rumour of a military patrol reaches the driver's ears, stopping briefly in forgotten villages where local officials collect their unofficial tolls not through noir-style briefcases, but through a ritual as mundane as breathing. Crumpled banknotes passed discreetly from palm to palm, a cup of bitter coffee offered to the transporters, a quick nod signalling that the load may continue unbothered. The white pill survives not because hardened criminals guard it, but because poorly paid bureaucrats see in it a steady drip of income that keeps their households afloat. And when the journey finally reaches the formal borders, small airports, secondary ports, backcountry crossings, the farce becomes almost theatrical, with the Tramadol shipments presenting themselves under a facade of flawless documentation. Forged certificates of origin, adorned with stamps that look official, imaginary lab analyses printed on crisp paper, packaging that could pass any visual inspection, every layer assembled with the precision of someone who knows exactly how to imitate legitimacy. And if a document happens to raise suspicion, there's always the second universal protocol, gratitude delivered in cash, because in many transit nations, a seized container becomes a problem only for the unfortunate soul who cannot tip the right official. What should be confiscated morphs into permitted cargo with the stroke of an approving stamp. Once these boxes complete the ocean crossings, survive the desert corridors and bypass the checkpoints, the final distribution looks shockingly ordinary. In Libya, they pile up in militia warehouses. In Egypt, they circulate through wholesale markets that operate before sunrise. In Ghana, Nigeria, or Mali, they appear in the hands of shopkeepers selling them beside sacks of rice, rechargeable batteries, and cut-price soap. Efficiency is so absolute that the supply never truly falters. If a shipment is seized, 2 more arrive through alternate routes. The global power of Tramadol smuggling lies not in violence or dramatic secrecy, but in its profound ability to blend seamlessly with the machinery of international trade. It travels disguised as legal goods, moves in the same channels as consumer products, and is fueled by small bribes that grease every link in the chain. What's most unsettling is that no nation actually controls its borders well enough to stop it. To block Tramadol, one would need to monitor every container, every crossing, every warehouse, every customs office, every individual official, and in a world moved by millions of tons of commerce daily, that ambition is absurd. And in the poorest corners of the planet, where legitimate pharmacies are distant luxuries and public health oversight exists only in slogans, Tramadol ceased to be a medication and became something elastic. Any white tablet promising strength, calm, or endurance adopted its name, even if not a single milligram of real Tramadol sat inside. This is where an entirely new market was born, one no longer dependent on clandestine manufacturers or international smugglers, but on something infinitely more dangerous. The chemical improvisation of local producers who turned bedrooms into drug labs, working in stifling heat beside rattling fans, pressing tablets on wooden tables with hand-operated machines originally meant for vitamins. The ingredients shift weekly like a chaotic recipe book. Industrial caffeine, expired antihistamines, rejected analgesics, menstrual pain powders, veterinary stimulants, cheap food dyes, wheat flour, even unidentified chemical leftovers, all blended with the only rule that matters: deliver an effect, not a formula. If a mixture induces drowsiness, or fog, or artificial energy, the maker christens it Tramadol 200, 300, extra strong, or any name that inspires confidence. In a market where labels mean nothing, branding is done by word of mouth. And the secret behind the success of these counterfeit versions isn't complicated, it's price. Fake Tramadol costs a fraction of the genuine product. In communities surviving on almost no income, quality becomes irrelevant compared to access. A real pill might cost the equivalent of a meal, the counterfeit one costs the price of a tea bag. When survival depends on swallowing something, anything, that makes a 12-hour workday possible, no one asks whether the pill is authentic. The only question is, does it hit? But that cheapness hides the deadliest trap. The dosage is never stable. One pill might contain barely a trace of active analgesic, while the next might be a chaotic cocktail of chemicals never meant for human consumption. Consumers learn this too late. A mild haze for one person, sudden psychotic episodes for another, and for many violent convulsions that no clinic can decipher because no one knows what was actually ingested. Rural doctors confront cases that appear nowhere in medical literature because they aren't treating tramadol overdoses. They're treating unpredictable chemical inventions pressed by amateurs. And beyond the makeshift operations lies the industrial counterfeit layer, far more polished and far more disturbing. workshops in various countries producing boxes identical to legitimate ones, complete with fake QR codes, imitated logos, and batch numbers copied from real pharmaceutical companies. These packages deceive even seasoned sellers. The producers understand how trust works. They craft premium variants with glossy colours, insert fabricated instruction leaflets, and even attach counterfeit holograms to imitate pharmaceutical authenticity. It is the final twist in a global illusion, a drug that began as a cheap analgesic and transformed into a worldwide masquerade, where legitimacy, illegitimacy, desperation, commerce, and chemistry blend until no border can separate them. In many street markets, the rule is almost comically grim. You're far more likely to buy a counterfeit Tramadol tablet than a legitimate one, and the only moment in which the illusion collapses is when someone actually swallows it and discovers the effect is wildly uneven, too soft, too sharp, or catastrophically overwhelming. Yet the crisis deepens because counterfeit batches often mingle with the real stock, making the purchase of a packet feel less like acquiring medicine and more like entering a chemical raffle where the prize could be relief, or a cocktail brewed from expired antihistamines, scrounged stimulants, and analgesics scraped from the bottom of the supply chain. Everyone knows this, and still they clutch the pills because the alternative is facing pain, exhaustion, or anxiety without any armour, and in neighbourhoods where bodies wear out young and work begins before dawn, the real question is never what am I taking, but can I afford not to take it? And for countless people hauling crates in fish markets, miners working beneath collapsing ceilings, mototaxi drivers weaving through chaotic traffic, or women carrying sacks under a sun that feels like a hammer, the answer is always no. In those regions, the bootleg versions became the daily fuel of people who will never see a specialist or receive regulated medicine. The danger is constant, but the need eclipses it completely, turning fake Tramadol into more than a pharmaceutical scam. It becomes a blunt indictment of systems where health is a privilege, regulation a myth, and survival requires trusting pills whose contents resemble roulette more than science. These users are not chasing highs, they are simply trying to endure another day. And while this counterfeit flood spread through markets, the world continued pretending that Tramadol was the obedient analgesic described in brochures, conference slides, and sales pitches, an allegedly gentle sedative that soothed, calmed, accompanied, but never chained. That was the foundational lie. In public hospitals, in neighbourhood clinics with peeling walls, in small health posts where reality is never filtered through glossy pamphlets, the evidence surfaced quietly. Patients returning for more tablets long after the original pain had vanished, young people unable to sleep without it, workers admitting that their bodies seemed to collapse whenever they tried to stop. The alarm did not begin with headlines. It began with whispering doctors noticing patterns that the manuals never dared to name. Tramadol withdrawal has nothing of the mild reputation advertised. In truth, it is so erratic, so vicious, that many clinicians mistake it for freestanding psychiatric collapse. It often starts with a strange internal vibration, a trembling deep in the chest and spine, as if the body were struggling to hold itself upright. Then comes a panic not recognizable as ordinary anxiety, but a state of total alarm, where the mind loses the ability to distinguish fabricated fear from real danger. Hot days bring sudden chills, sweat turns icy, the heart races, fatigue becomes a prison, and stillness feels unbearable, pushing people to pace aimlessly through the night because standing still hurts more than walking. But the defining cruelty of Tramadol is rooted in its dual nature. It interferes with pain pathways while simultaneously manipulating serotonin and noradrenaline, turning withdrawal into a biochemical storm. When serotonin collapses, sadness does not appear as an emotion, but as a physical heaviness crushing the chest, a wordless dread, a sinking sense that something is wrong with the world, even if you cannot name what. Many describe the coming-off period as a black vacuum, an inner silence that devours all positive thought. Then there are the symptoms the pharmaceutical companies never dared print: violent irritability, episodes of feeling detached from one's own body, irrational fear of darkness, sudden crying fits, intrusive despair, and cognitive fragmentation so severe that focusing on a sentence, a voice, or a familiar sound becomes impossible. For those who used it for weeks or months, quitting can feel like the brain flickers on and off, moments of clarity drowned by sudden waves of dizziness, ringing ears, blurred vision, and a pins and needles creep along the hands and jaw. Eventually the nervous system retaliates against the body. Cramps twist legs into knots, muscles spasm uncontrollably, sleep shatters, vomiting erupts without warning, diarrhea drains every ounce of strength, and a rigid ache crawls up the neck that terrifies even experienced physicians. In the harshest cases, seizures strike, episodes that resemble epilepsy but are not, scaring users so badly that many return to Tramadol not out of desire, but out of fear of the withdrawal that nearly killed them. In poor neighbourhoods, one phrase repeats like a survival mantra: it's easier to keep taking it than to go through that again. And then comes the symptom that fools even professionals: hallucinations, but not bright cinematic visions. They are subtle, auditory, emotional shadows, voices that whisper from nowhere, a sudden certainty that death is near, the eerie feeling of being watched, shapes flickering at the edges of sight. These episodes appear most often in those consuming high dosages or adulterated pills, blurring withdrawal with madness. In many rural clinics, doctors fail to connect these symptoms to Tramadol at all, because the myth of low addiction risk remains so deeply embedded that it seems unthinkable that such a cheap common pill could unleash chaos of this scale. Every warning sign, tremors, profound depression, neuromuscular spasms, panic attacks, seizures, psychotic breaks, had been visible from the earliest cases. Evidence was never the missing ingredient. What was missing was the willingness to acknowledge it. The companies simply could not afford to lose a global market measured in tens of millions of desperate, unprotected customers. Governments refused to tighten controls on a painkiller that was cheap and convenient, and physicians resisted the idea that they had underestimated a threat hiding in plain sight. So Tramadol withdrawal remained an open secret never granted a line in any official manual. For millions, dependence didn't begin as a vice but as a practical crutch, yet escaping it becomes a punishing uphill climb, filled with symptoms no harmless medication should ever unleash. And that is the final irony. Sold as a chainless analgesic, it reveals its trap only when someone tries to live without it, and discovers that the real cage is the emptiness it leaves behind. Across the places where Tramadol moves like a common household remedy, there exists a truth that never appears in brochures or public health campaigns. The pill rarely kills alone. The reaper arrives when desperate people amplify its effects with whatever substance is nearby. A sip of bottom-shelf liquor, a gulp of cough syrup spiked with codeine, or a forgotten diazepam tablet dug out of a drawer. In neighbourhoods where improvised chemistry is routine, nobody worries about interaction warnings. They worry about surviving another night, working through the pain, quieting their nerves, or finding an hour of unbroken sleep, and that is how the perfect recipe for not waking up is created. Tramadol with alcohol, the silence that tightens the lungs. Alcohol becomes the most common partner not out of popularity but out of availability. In many countries, the cheapest drink costs less than bottled water, and mixing it with Tramadol appears, at first glance, to offer deeper relaxation, but inside the body the combination is a lethal duet. Both substances dim the central nervous system like someone switching off lamps and then cutting the main power altogether, leaving breath thick and sluggish. First comes the heavy sleep, then the body stops responding. Rural clinicians call these deaths dreams that carried someone too far, because there is no struggle, no warning, just a fading breath. Most victims never intended an overdose. They only wanted rest after an exhausting day. Then there is Tramadol with codeine, the mixture that deceives even seasoned users. In North Africa and the Middle East, this pairing is remarkably common, and it is far more treacherous than alcohol because codeine, arriving in medicinal disguise, creates a false sense of safety. People assume that if both substances have pharmaceutical names, the mixture must be tolerable, but combining two opioids, even mild ones, overloads the very receptors that regulate breathing. The danger isn't the moment of death, but the speed at which consciousness evaporates. Individuals who have taken both for years with no issue collapse instantly when the two finally collide in the bloodstream because the body cannot handle depressants that strike at different tempos. Tramadol hits later, codeine sooner, and by the time Tramadol exerts its full effect, the system is already half asleep. What follows is barely perceptible breathing, a faint pulse, reflexes gone. Many of these fatalities are catalogued as sudden collapses because no one imagines the combination as the culprit. The bitter twist is that users take the pairing in search of stronger relief, and they find it, but their bodies cannot withstand the result. Then comes Tramadol with diazepam, the mixture that turns sleep into coma. Diazepam, cheap and common, sits in countless homes as a remedy for stress, insomnia, or nerves, and when blended with Tramadol it produces devastation. Diazepam softens breathing too deeply, and Tramadol doesn't counteract it. It drives it further downward. The person enters a strange twilight. Warmth remains, the heart beats faintly, but the lungs sink into a quiet so deep the brain no longer receives oxygen. There is no convulsion, no outward sign of crisis, just a sleep from which they will not awaken. In Liberia, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, doctors have a name for it, the quiet blackout, a hush that should never exist, yet plays out daily. Why do people mix without fear? The answer has nothing to do with rebellion or thrill-seeking. It lies in the brutal architecture of their lives, relentless labour, constant stress, chronic pain, unending nights. The mixture becomes a patch, not an act of self-destruction. People combine substances because no one warned them that these combinations can still their lungs, because they don't read leaflets, because they have no physicians to guide them, because they never imagined a cheap analgesic could act like an undercover opioid. Many believe that if a pill is sold in a pharmacy, or something that looks like one, it must be friendly to the body. They never suspect that mixing it with alcohol, syrup, or anxiolytics could transform that trust into a sentence. And so we arrive at the final cocktail, the recipe that fills morgue logs across poor countries. The reports show the same pattern. Teenagers with no medical history, exhausted adults labouring under impossible workloads, women who only wanted sleep, men who only wanted strength, all found with combinations of Tramadol and other depressants, coursing through their bloodstreams. This mixture forgives no one. It offers no second chances. Most of the dead never realised they were constructing their own chemical gravestone with 2 or 3 substances that, on their own, seem harmless. That is the final paradox. Tramadol was marketed as a low-risk analgesic, yet the world turned it into the foundational ingredient of a cocktail that, mixed with whatever the user can find, has the power to transform an ordinary night into the last sleep they will ever take. When Tramadol crossed into Europe, it did not arrive like another regulated pharmaceutical, but as the emotional luggage of thousands of migrants who slipped across borders chasing work, paperwork, or simply a place where everyday life might hurt a little less. In their home countries the pill had been cheap, familiar, almost ordinary, but on European soil it became a controlled medicine with a price tag far beyond reach. And that contrast carved out an unexpected phenomenon, a shadow market created not by criminal syndicates, but by people who were simply trying to maintain the one habit that had carried them through years of hardship. This was the birth of the European Tramadol economy, the low-cost drug of the migrant poor. In France, it manifested as silent overdoses among those who toil out of sight in the industrial edges of Paris, Marseille, Toulouse, districts dense with informal workshops, temporary contracts, and apartments stuffed with too many occupants. Tramadol became another survival tool. Migrant workers, exhausted from brutal shifts in construction, delivery, cleaning, and warehouse logistics, swallowed it to mute their pain, to sleep on mattresses that barely deserved the name, or to hold down the anxiety that comes from living one administrative check away from being expelled. What had once been manageable became lethal in France because none of the tablets circulating among these men arrived in proper boxes. They reached the suburbs through smuggling routes from North Africa, stripped of dosage information, stripped of any certainty. Many were mixtures of unknown origin that multiplied the risks, and when someone combined these questionable pills with the cheap alcohol sold everywhere in peripheral neighbourhoods, the result could be fatal. Hospitals in Ile-de-France began noticing a recurring pattern. Young men with no major medical history arriving with seizures, respiratory collapse, or deep unconsciousness. Every one of them had swallowed some form of trauma, tamol. Not a single tablet was genuine. None carried consistent potency, and almost none of these patients spoke enough French to explain what they had taken. That is how an uncomfortable statistic emerged. Overdoses tied to Tramadol among migrants represent a public health problem that France records but rarely acknowledges. Spain developed its own version of the phenomenon. Instead of erupting with the abrupt violence seen in France, it unfolded in the quiet roots of informal commerce, street markets, call centres, overcrowded apartments, and community networks linking entire groups from West Africa and the Maghreb. Tramadol travelled in suitcases, postal boxes, second-hand cars and vans crossing the strait from Morocco, carrying ordinary goods, and a few extra bags no one listed on the manifest. What surprised Spanish authorities was not recreational abuse but the pill's use as a work tool, migrants enduring precarious jobs in warehouses, endless agricultural shifts in the south, night security posts, and loading or unloading tasks where muscle pain is a daily fact. Most did not want a high. They wanted endurance, and that practicality is what fed its popularity. In neighbourhoods like El Raval in Barcelona, Lavapiés in Madrid, and pockets of Almería and Murcia, Tramadol is sold in tiny amounts for cash only, following a ritual as discreet as it is predictable. A short phrase in Wolof, Arabic or French, a small bag and a tablet whose authenticity no one can guarantee because the supply chain begins somewhere in the Sahel, where counterfeit production thrives. This market is not run by large organisations but by small-scale sellers inside their own communities, people without legal status, without access to healthcare, without the means to pay for regulated analgesics, all forced to rely on mystery pills because they have no alternative. And here appears Europe's cultural shock. In the countries where these migrants were born, Tramadol is sold openly, cheaply, as casually as candy. In Europe it is serious medicine, prescribed carefully, watched closely. Many newcomers do not understand the difference, and that misunderstanding breeds danger. They assume they can take the same quantities they used before, but Europe is flooded not with regulated Tramadol, but with counterfeit versions, boosted, weakened, or adulterated entirely. Dependence escalates fast, tolerance faster. What used to be 2 pills becomes 4. What once worked alone now requires alcohol or benzodiazepines to hit, and when the mix becomes too strong, the morgue fills without debate. Europe, largely uninterested in looking inward, rarely speaks of this crisis because it affects a population living below the official radar. Undocumented couriers, seasonal farmhands, men and women in back-breaking jobs, youth sending money home, people structurally invisible. For them, Tramadol is comfort, relief, and burden all at once. Europe never saw the crisis coming because it never understood its roots. The pill did not spread as a recreational drug, but as a survival mechanism, imported by those performing the labour no one else wants. And as long as inequality, exploitation, and a counterfeit-ridden market persist, Tramadol will remain in France, Spain, and beyond. The silent drug of the poor migrant, cheap, dangerous, omnipresent, hidden in ripped pockets, shared drawers in crowded apartments, and suitcases crossing borders without declaring anything. There are cities where, at a certain late afternoon hour, a sight appears that no tourist brochure would ever show. Streets fill with young bodies drifting forward as if the air itself had grown too heavy to push through. They do not run, do not talk, do not react. They simply walk, suspended between exhaustion and chemical endurance, silhouettes moving through a Europe that neither sees them nor wants to. It looks like someone dimmed half their senses and left the remaining portion running on leftover momentum, and from a distance the slow drift of their bodies resembles exhaustion. But up close it becomes something far stranger. People suspended in an in-between state, not quite alive in the ordinary sense and not entirely absent either. Along the sidewalks, whole clusters lean against walls with their chins collapsed onto their chests, arms hanging like loosened cables, eyes fixed on a point that no one else can perceive, some frozen for long minutes like accidental statues placed in the middle of traffic. Others shuffle forward with a strange sway, unable to walk in a straight line even when the street is empty. They look drunk, but there is no alcohol at work here, only a peculiar kind of neurological disconnection that slows every gesture and turns ordinary avenues into surreal theatre stages. In certain districts, the benches of public squares no longer serve anyone who wants to sit. They have become crutches for bodies folding sideways, heads drooping toward the ground near market entrances, and young people stand motionless in front of stalls as if they've forgotten what they were buying. At intersections, some stop in the middle of the crosswalk, as though the concept of a traffic light has slipped from their memory entirely. Shopkeepers walk past without flinching. Neighbours curve their paths as if these slumped figures were part of the permanent architecture, and the most unsettling transformation happens at dusk. When daylight thins out, many of these youths begin moving in a mechanical trance, dragged steps, oversized pupils, steady but shallow breathing, slow blinks that resemble tiny power outages inside the brain. Occasionally one collapses onto the pavement with no warning, as if the body simply declared, "No further." Sometimes they lie there a few seconds before rising and continuing in the same direction with the same empty gaze. Police, when they appear, rarely intervene. They watch. They know chasing them achieves nothing. These individuals are not aggressive, not demanding, not shouting. They wander, fold, sleep, fall, rise. Shadows occupying the same coordinates every day, a silent battalion that neither attacks nor truly lives. In the early hours, hospitals take in a steady trickle. Young men with irregular pulses, sluggish respiration, tremors climbing through their limbs, episodes of disorientation where they cannot recall their names or why they ended up there. Some arrive unconscious, others wake confused after collapsing blocks away. For medical staff, this has ceased to be an extraordinary emergency. It is simply the nocturnal routine. Cities adjust, the drivers slow down to avoid hitting wavering bodies, street vendors reroute to avoid collapse-prone corners, families learn to recognize the gate that is too slow or the stair that is too hollow, so they can quietly pull relatives off the street before they drop in the wrong place. At first glance, it resembles a public health issue, but in lived reality it feels like something deeper, an everyday transformation of public space into a landscape where hundreds of young people drift as if time itself were brushing past them without making contact. Entire streets become corridors of chemical sleep. Parks shift from playgrounds to open-air dormitories for bent bodies. Corners thicken with a silence heavier than traffic noise. It is the sort of image that shocks you the first time you witness it, and terrifies you even more once you no longer react. And beneath that visible crisis lies another form of consumption, one that never appears in official statistics, never splashes across headlines, never produces zombie-like scenes in open daylight. It is quiet, almost domestic, tucked into drawers beside receipts, cheap cosmetics, and unsent notes. It is the consumption of women who do not take tramadol to escape, but to endure. In countless homes, the pill is deliberately placed in strategic hiding spots. The pocket of a kitchen apron, a sewing box, the shelf used for everyday plates. There is no ritual, no drama, only a swift gesture made before returning to whatever task was interrupted. Sometimes it is a tablet at dawn to coax stiff backs into motion. Sometimes a second at midday to muffle a tightening in the chest that no one else notices. Sometimes a third swallowed without counting doses to guarantee a night without memories. Their depression does not announce itself in tears but in silence. Shortened conversations, eyes drifting away in the middle of a sentence, an artificial calm that settles like a damp cloth over thoughts too painful to examine. Tramadol does not sedate them so much as flatten them, sanding down the internal edges where sharp emotions could hook. In neighbourhoods where raised voices leak through the walls, where arguments repeat nightly, where some women remain trapped in relationships they cannot leave, the pill becomes a tiny emotional strike, turning down the volume just enough to dull the hurt without halting the day. Bruises are hidden beneath long sleeves, tremors get masked by washing dishes, nausea is explained with a quiet, "I haven't eaten well." Nobody asks, nobody suspects, and they prefer it that way. The most unsettling detail is the secrecy. Men consume together, in groups, on streets, at work. Women consume alone, no boasting, no comparing doses, no shared advice. Only a solitary decision repeated like a reflex, a private bargain struck day after day, invisible to everyone except the one who needs it to keep going. Today is another day, I can't get through without it, and with each sunrise the dose inches upward, almost accidentally. What began as half a pill to quiet nerves becoming 2 tablets to hush the mind, then 3 to slip into sleep, then 4 because the body no longer responds. And unlike men whose overdoses often announce themselves in public collapse, the deterioration in women happens inwardly. Skin losing its vitality, hands shaking only when unobserved, breath thinning to shallow sips, panic surges hidden behind a bathroom door, moments of dissociation they cannot explain. Tramadol allows them to keep functioning inside environments where they are expected to hold every burden at once: work, care, cooking, survival. And they rarely call it addiction. They call it my helper, my soothing dose, my support, my pill to endure. Doctors discover the truth far too late, when one arrives at the emergency ward convulsing for reasons no one can decipher, or another breaks into an unexplained collapse that defies diagnosis, or a third whispers that she has spent months taking something that made her feel lighter, by which point dependency has wrapped itself around her like a second skin. Society notices men falling in the streets, but women fall inward, and that interior collapse is harder to see, harder to confess, and far harder to stop. In this hidden pattern of use, Tramadol does not behave like a recreational substance or even a physical stimulant. It acts as anesthesia for the soul, the only valve many have to blunt realities that would otherwise carve them open. Once the pill stops being an analgesic and becomes a tool for getting through a day without feeling, cities begin registering a new class of tragedies, incidents that look unrelated until you draw the lines between them. They are not spectacular overdoses or zombie-like scenes. They are mundane catastrophes, strange collisions, inexplicable falls, arguments that erupt too quickly, choices made in a split-second blackout, the toll of living numbed. Accidents surface first. Drivers who break one heartbeat too late because their minds are wrapped in dense fog. Workers losing balance on scaffolds because their legs misfire. Motorcyclists staring at a point on the pavement until they crash into a post they once dodged easily. In emergency rooms, the refrain is always the same. I don't know what happened, I just shut off. Not sleepiness, not distraction, but the moment where Tramadol drops the body's guard without stopping its momentum, creating a clumsy choreography that ends in broken bones, twisted metal, or scars no one connects to a pill. Then comes the violence, the most unexpected kind. Not screaming rage, but internal pressure bursting outward when the drug's effect fluctuates. Domestic disputes that snap into physical aggression, couples shifting from words to pushes without knowing why, neighbours starting trivial disagreements that escalate into thrown objects. The anaesthetic does not erase emotions, it compresses them, and when they return they arrive carrying confusion, impulsivity, and momentary loss of control, turning minor tensions into hazards. And in the darkest corner of this equation are the suicides, not planned, not pre-announced, not accompanied by goodbye notes, but sudden, improvised, nearly automatic ruptures, a fatal jump from a balcony, handfuls of tablets swallowed without counting, cuts meant only to feel something but drawn too deep. Families always say the same. It didn't seem like a farewell, they were just acting off, distant, which is exactly what Tramadol does when it stops numbing pain and begins numbing judgment, flattening risk perception, until only seconds separate emotional crisis from irreversible action, and the pill erases those seconds. Then there are hybrid episodes, accidents that look like accidents but aren't entirely, falls through open windows because someone got dizzy, drownings in bathtubs because sleep arrived too abruptly, fatal head impacts triggered by a simple lapse in balance. Police reports file them as domestic mishaps, but the bodies reveal the same clues: slow pupils, heavy breaths, fragments of tablets in pockets. The hidden cost is not in the visible dead, but in everything shifting around them. Families losing trust because emotional explosions appear without cause. Employers firing workers for negligence, unaware the real culprit was an anesthetized mind. Streets becoming hazardous because no one can predict who is moving while disconnected inside. Neighbourhoods adapting to a constant low-level emotional tremor. Tramadol does not unleash chaos all at once. It releases it in fragments. An accident today, a fight tomorrow, a suicide attempt over the weekend, an absurd fracture next week. None seems related, but all are woven together. When a pill becomes the strategy for surviving the day, what truly gets numbed is not pain, but the ability to avoid catastrophe. And once that capacity dissolves, life becomes unbearably expensive. In some regions, the word doctor no longer evokes lab coats, clinics, stethoscopes, or waiting rooms. It means a plastic chair under a sun-bleached scrap of shade, a folding table coated in dust, and a transparent bag swollen with tablets of different shapes and colours. And there in the heat that bends the horizon like molten metal, healthcare has been reduced to a gesture so small it barely qualifies as medicine. A man reaches into his bag, snaps a pill in half with his fingers, and hands it over without asking a single question. There is no medical history, no diagnosis, no checklist of symptoms, only loose tablets travelling in plastic bags as if they were cheap candy. These makeshift clinics rise wherever possible, beside an old truck whose rusted frame provides shade, beneath a tarp held up with frayed rope, against an adobe wall crumbling into powder. People arrive on foot, in limping motorcycles, on burros, after hours under a punishing sky. They don't come with defined symptoms, but with the universal sentence of these regions, give me something so I can keep going. And the improvised medics, former nurses, former assistants, or men who simply memorized which pill quiets which pain, dispense Tramadol as if they were giving out aspirin. The plastic bag is the new prescription. It's folded, tied with a knot, and inside might be 1 pill, 2, 5, or a whole handful. No instructions, no doses, no warnings. Each patient deciphers the meaning on their own. Some take 1 a day, some swallow them like seeds, others distribute them among friends. In these puestos there is no line between medicine and narcotic. There is only the word relief. What unsettles most is how normal everything feels. Children waiting while playing with empty wrappers, women picking up pills for husbands without knowing what they take, elders stuffing entire bags into loose robes so they don't have to return tomorrow. The medics don't write, don't record, don't remember. Each person is a quick exchange, a transaction, another plastic bag disappearing into the crowd. Health deterioration shows itself through small cracks. Hands trembling as they count coins, skin turning grainy and dry, eyes dulled to flickering embers, steps unsteady, silences that stretch too long. No one links these signs to the pills because no one here talks about side effects. They talk about surviving heat, exhaustion, back pain, insomnia, dread. Tramadol is handed out as a universal answer. The body pushes through, the mind dims, the problem remains. Sometimes they carry in someone collapsed, wrapped in a blanket, lifted by several arms. The medic searches their pockets, finds bits of loose pills, examines them, and simply says, "He took too much." There are no ambulances, no IVs, no oxygen tanks. They fan the unconscious with cardboard, splash water on the face, hope for movement. If it doesn't come, the family carries the body away. The puesto resumes its routine. Another bag opens. Another pill breaks in half. Another patient steps forward. At nightfall, the heat subsides. The puesto dismantles, tables fold, chairs stack. Half-empty bags slip into worn backpacks. The medics walk into the dust knowing tomorrow will repeat, distributing packaged relief, without rules, without oversight, without responsibility. In places where public health isn't a system but a shattered illusion, Tramadol fills the void like a minor deity. Not curing, not repairing, not preventing, only muffling everything until degradation advances quietly and hope becomes a rumour. In buildings where health is administered behind soft carpets and silent elevators, Tramadol never appears as a crisis. It appears as revenue, a steady line on spreadsheets, a profitable product sliding through quarterly reports. While chaos grows in the streets, conference rooms review charts and upward curves. They do not discuss addiction, convulsions, zombie walkers, or women collapsing inward. They discuss emerging markets, rising volumes, sustained demand. In those glass floors, pharmaceutical companies never say Tramadol creates dependency. They say it exhibits a favourable safety profile. They do not say it decimates entire communities. They say its availability improves quality of life. They do not say it is counterfeited, diluted, trafficked, swallowed without oversight. They say misuse occurs in unregulated sectors. The magic of corporate language is simple. Turn a wildfire into a statistical anomaly. The most chilling aspect is the nature of their silence. Not nervous, not fearful of scandal, but professional, polished, fully woven into routine. Committees gather, glance at reports, notice that sales climb in regions where no other medicine penetrates so deeply, then move to the next slide. Everything is documented, archived, categorized, nothing questioned. When governments demand explanations, the companies respond with immaculate phrases. They comply with all regulations, addiction is multifactorial, countries must strengthen controls, their safety dossiers are available upon request. Answers engineered to sound responsible while saying nothing at all. A verbal choreography designed to feign transparency while hiding the only honest sentence. We will not sacrifice a profitable market. Inside the air-conditioned corridors where global production strategies are shaped, Tramadol never shows up as a humanitarian crisis. It appears instead as a logistical advantage, a tidy column of figures promising steady profit. Manufacturing costs stay low, margins stay high, competitors multiply but pose no threat because the product is cheap, familiar, and constantly in demand. There is no need for ad campaigns, no need to court new markets, The world's fractured economies generate their own customers. For an industry that measures life in units sold, there is no sweeter equation. Even when reports of intercepted shipments, counterfeits, deaths, overdoses, or saturated markets drift across their desks, the companies possess the perfect shield. Blame the imitators. Not our medicine, they say. They are knockoffs. Thus every tragedy becomes an alibi, every corpse a footnote proving corporate innocence. Executives can look straight at the photos of seizures, skim reports describing young people collapsing in the streets, see images of emergency rooms crushed under the weight of chemical despair, and still recite the same corporate mantra. Our product is safe when used correctly. In this theatre of expert rhetoric, truth doesn't vanish. It dissolves. It dissolves into meeting minutes, compliance memos, footnoted clauses, regulatory statements, PR drafts repeating the same idea dressed in 1,000 costumes. The pill is fine. The people are the problem. And while that illusion holds, the money keeps flowing, the charts keep rising, the meetings end on schedule, and the executives descend into their underground parking lots without ever being confronted by the vision of convulsing bodies or parents burying children. None of that enters their briefings. The industry does not close its eyes. The industry simply chooses not to see, because acknowledging reality would mean admitting that their stable, cheap, high-volume analgesic, the golden child of their portfolio, is also a shadow darkening half the planet. And shadows only matter in those boardrooms when they shrink profit margins. Meanwhile, in the political hallways where lawmakers pretend to be busy, Tramadol has gone through more legal identities than a smudged photocopy. Banned, regulated, permitted, restricted, reopened, banned once more, reconsidered, rewritten in midnight amendments. Each administration invents its own regulatory logic, and each system fails worse than the one before, not for lack of laws, but for excess incompetence in enforcing them. One day officials declare with solemn gravity that Tramadol now requires strict prescription. The next day, because no one knows how to implement it, photocopied prescriptions begin circulating, bogus stamps appear, signatures look like a child's scribble. Then, when half the country suddenly finds itself without basic analgesics, the ministry rushes to hold an emergency conference to correct the misunderstanding, reopening the gates until another alarming report triggers another knee-jerk clampdown. It is a grotesque choreography in which the public never knows if the pill is legal, semi-legal, tolerated, or technically prohibited but always available on every corner. Border control performs no better. Sometimes inspections tighten, boxes get seized, press photos are taken, promises of sweeping reform fill microphones. 2 weeks later, the same officials wave entire shipments through because the rules changed again or because nobody briefed them on which boxes are legitimate and which are not. Corruption fills the gaps. Where a law lasts less than a banknote, the banknote always wins. Parliamentary debates provide no salvation, an expensive spectacle of confusion. Some demand total prohibition, others defend medical use, a few beg for more research, many argue technicalities they barely understand. None mention the fundamental truth. Legislation mutates faster than reality. Out on the streets, the jargon, pharmacological classification, controlled list, regulatory tier means nothing. There is only a pill people obtain with or without policy. The most ridiculous twist is that countries copy foreign regulatory models without adjusting them. Some proudly announce new requirements for traceable verification codes, forgetting that half their markets sell loose pills with no packaging at all. Others call for digital registries in areas where electricity itself flickers like a dying candle. Others vow to halt illegal imports with scanners that don't work, staff who are overextended, and budgets that can't cover printer ink. Bureaucracy becomes a labyrinth without a centre. Health authorities issue contradictory circulars. Doctors receive directives that shift so quickly they stop reading them. Pharmacies no longer know what to sell, what to request, what to report, what to hide. When confusion becomes unbearable, ministers hold another press conference to promise a comprehensive regulatory framework that collapses the moment it touches the real world. And through this administrative farce, Tramadol continues its circulation, not because it is unstoppable, but because those meant to stop it cannot even find the starting line. The politicians legislate like players inventing rules for a game they do not comprehend, and the result remains unchanged. Chaos above, chaos below, and a product gliding effortlessly through the cracks their own decisions create. Amid the noise, the raids, the impulsive bans, the overinflated speeches, there is one group almost never mentioned: people who live with real pain. Not existential pressure, not fatigue, not metaphorical ache, but the raw, physical torment that burrows into bone like a rusted nail and steals sleep, work, movement, breath. For them, Tramadol is not escape, not chemical thrill, but the thin line separating a life trapped in bed from a life barely manageable. When governments tightened the laws, the first bodies to fall were not the traffickers hiding between supply chains, but the patients who had been using the drug exactly as prescribed, and the collapse began quietly. Pharmacies stopped handing it out unless a near-impossible prescription appeared. Physicians started avoiding the drug altogether out of fear that one signature could bring sanctions, and hospitals reduced supplies to the point where every tablet became a personal favour disguised as medical procedure. Those living with genuine pain found themselves trapped inside a system unable to distinguish desperation from misuse. Because regulations were built on suspicion, everyone guilty until the paperwork proved otherwise. Waiting rooms began filling with scenes that would have looked comedic if they weren't so cruel. Elderly people with joints swollen like burning stone explaining, with trembling voices that they didn't want to high, only the possibility of moving their fingers without crying. Women recovering from spine surgeries describing the simple responsibility of needing to walk because their children depended on them. Cancer patients whispering through clenched teeth that they had already waited hours for analgesia blocked by a protocol someone was still trying to decipher. Doctors, forced to choose between compassion and self-preservation, sometimes shed tears in hallways because they knew exactly what they should prescribe but feared that their handwriting might trigger an audit that would crush their careers. Fear, not science, replaced medicine, and here the cruel twist emerged. The only people who could no longer obtain Tramadol were the ones who needed it the most, while those who had never touched it before could purchase it with ease in street markets. Genuine pain became collateral damage in a war against abuse, and every legal mechanism designed to slow down misuse succeeded only in punishing the individuals who had never misused anything at all. In many countries, chronic patients evolved into experts of bureaucratic survival, mapping which physician dared to prescribe without trembling, which pharmacy received tiny guarded shipments, which hospital still dispensed controlled doses, which day of the month was safest to arrive before the stock disappeared. Some travelled to other cities using money they didn't have just to secure the medication needed to function through another day, a day in which their bodies felt nailed together by fire. Each tablet became a bitter triumph, but the most heartbreaking part was the silence. These people didn't march, didn't break windows, didn't form militias, didn't go viral. They suffered quietly in dim bedrooms, on rigid clinic beds, in small homes where no one could hear the pain eating through their sleep. Pain does not shout, but it devours entire lives. In this global crackdown, the only soldiers left without weapons were those trapped inside their own bones. In an ideal world, health systems would distinguish an addict from a patient. In this one, simpler, harsher, the prohibition falls like a stone on everyone at once, crushing hardest those who are already on the ground. And while the illegal market blooms in every direction, the silent tragedy continues, thousands stuck between agony and bureaucracy, forced into a limbo where the one analgesic that could help is accessible to everyone except them. The world keeps talking about Tramadol as though it were a wildfire destined to burn out on its own. Politicians rehearse promises of greater control, international agencies unveil strategic frameworks, experts write lengthy reports destined to gather dust. But reality is darker, simpler, and infinitely harder to extinguish. This cheap opioid has no expiration date. It will not vanish tomorrow, not in the next decade, and likely not in the next several, not because it is invincible, but because the modern world is constructed perfectly for its survival. Tramadol thrives in a space everyone pretends does not exist, the vast territory between inaccessible healthcare and relentless physical suffering, in countries without anesthesiologists, without pain clinics, where hospitals lock away morphine as if it were gold, reserving it for extreme cases only. That vacuum becomes fertile ground for a small, affordable tablet that functions as the only bridge between unbearable pain and a life barely tolerable. As long as that gap exists, any prohibition will simply force Tramadol to migrate to another route, another market, another formulation, another counterfeit. Its creation is too simple to disappear. No state-of-the-art laboratory is needed, only a makeshift workshop, a desperate chemist, or someone willing to replicate a leaked formula with whatever ingredients lie nearby. The illegal industry evolves faster than any regulator. While governments sit in committees drafting resolutions, pirate manufacturers are already pressing new versions, stronger, cheaper, harder to track. Counterfeiting guarantees its survival. Tramadol does not depend on a brand, a shape, a logo, a particular milligram. It can be white, pink, oval, round, marked, unmarked, boxed, unboxed, wrapped in foil, or pressed in a bedroom under a rusty fan. It is a chemical chameleon. If banned in one country, it resurfaces with a different name next door. If one dosage is outlawed, new ones appear. If importation is controlled, clandestine factories multiply like roots beneath soil. Trying to stop it is like attempting to hold back a river with a sieve. Price seals its future. As long as real medication remains expensive, health systems remain broken, and millions live paycheck to paycheck. An accessible analgesic will win every time. Specialists may warn of risks, but warnings dissolve instantly when weighed against a night of piercing pain or a job that cannot be done without relief. When survival depends on affordability, medical debate becomes irrelevant. Low price means permanent demand. Organised crime also ensures its continuation. For countless groups, tramadol is ideal commerce, less persecuted than heroin, easier to transport, requiring no fields, no labs guarded by rifles, and sold in staggering quantities to enormous populations. It does not need glamour, mythology, or kingpins. It is discreet, industrial, profitable. Dismantling that system would require a global economic revolution, not a new law. The last nail sealing its permanence is international negligence. The crisis does not grace headlines, does not provoke moral panic, does not threaten the powerful, and its most catastrophic effects erupt primarily in Africa and Asia, not in Europe or the United States. Political pressure remains weak. As long as it does not endanger first world interests, responses will remain slow, superficial, partial, diluted in bureaucracy before they even begin. And so the future of tramadol is not an unsolved question. It is a grim certainty. It persists because the world needs it, manufactures it, tolerates it, and in the worst corners consumes it without knowing what it is. And while governments promise strategies and international bodies draft action plans, the cheap opioid continues gliding through legal cracks, across invisible routes, through clandestine workshops, into millions of desperate hands. Not because it offers pleasure, but because for many it is the only thing they have left.